Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming today. My name is Rossen Totev. I work for a company, for Software. And today we'll present a session on unit testing. The session will go with, as I cover some topics, there'll be a few demos, so feel free during the demos to ask any questions that come up. And of course, there'll be the regular, at the end of the session, Q&A. Hopefully we have time for that. So, what is unit testing? We'll start with a simple definition that I just got from Wikipedia. Basically unit testing is a method by which individual units of source code are tested to determine if they are fit for a use. Basically, whether they do what they're supposed to do. Now, this is kind of a dry definition, and what I would, in my mind, how I refer to unit testing is basically something that proves that your code actually works. Because it is one thing just writing code versus actually seeing a real result on the fact that what you just did meets the requirements and does its job. So unit testing is pretty much a methodology and a framework with some tools that allow you to do just that while you're programming, to quickly see that your code works correctly, allows you to get a feedback from basically the software that you're writing on your progress, on things that you have to fix, things that don't work and don't meet the expectations. What are the benefits of unit testing? The most important thing is that any defects in your code are discovered during the development cycle. That means that it is much cheaper to find a bug right then while you're coding that specific part of your application, versus having to wait for something to be deployed to the customer or even go to QA. They start testing, figuring out if there's something's wrong, send it back to developers. The developer has to go and find what exactly that is, open the file, figure out what the file was about, read some contextual information before and after, get back to the development mode and fix the bug. This is usually for developers, it's the task shifting takes some time until they kind of load into their memory all the variables and things that go on. So by just reducing the time and the efforts needed to fix bugs, it reduces the cost of developing a software. Another benefit from the unit test is that it facilitates changes and simplifies the integration of one piece of software that you're working on with the rest of with the overall system that you're developing. And why is that? By having a simple proof that the code that you have written or modified continues to work and meets expectations, you have a greater confidence on attempting some changes, because you have a really easy way of figuring out immediately whether the changes that you made in one part of the system affected something else. Also, testable code usually promotes better design, because to make a code easily testable usually requires that the different parts of the system are decoupled. They're not tightly coupled together. Things are correctly abstracted, so you can take a part of the application and isolate it from the outside environment and be able to run the tests again only a small portion of your system. By doing that, you not only make the code testable, but it makes your application modular It allows it to grow. It allows things to be interchangeable. So you don't end up with one big monolithic block, but you end up with multiple small modules that can be fit or modified when needed, replaced with different things as requirements change. So that's why, by having this in mind while developing and having it on your agenda as a developer to do these types of things promotes the overall design of your application. Another good thing from the unit testing is that you basically have a live documentation on the code. You have a real example of how the code is supposed to work, what are the expected results of it, or the things that when there are any exceptions, you know, okay, if you do this, this type of exceptional conditions are expected to happen, and so forth. So for a developer, the new developer that comes on board, sometimes it's very easy just looking at the unit tests to immediately see, okay, how the system is supposed to work, how the API is supposed to be used. Also, the unit tests, just by their nature, are constantly in sync with your source code. So you don't have a documentation somewhere on the side that, as you change your code, it gets out of sync, and all of a sudden you have this application that does certain things and a documentation from a year ago that doesn't reflect the changes. The unit tests, just because you constantly work with them, they are in sync always with your source code. If they are not, obviously this unit test will start to fail, and you know what certain things you have to update on the unit tests in order to cover the changes in the code. Of course, there are some considerations that have to be accounted for when doing unit tests. In general, unit tests do help to improve the code quality. However, they're not a cure for all bugs possible. In other words, they have a very specific place in the development cycle. They test individual units of code, be it a single form, the individual methods on that form, or some other small module. But they definitely will not be able to replace things like integration or acceptance testing, where you have to make sure that not just the individual pieces work, but they work as one whole thing and interact correctly as is expected. So unit tests don't cover that. They're just the first step, making sure that the individual methods and functions or very small units of code work as intended. And of course, unit tests are just more code that usually developers are tasked to write and maintain. So there is some overhead related with unit testing that has to be taken into consideration when plans are made for release dates and so forth. So one easy way is just to pad all your expectations with the time needed in order to do the unit tests. But they do pay off in the long run, having those unit tests, because they can they can reduce greatly the maintenance of the code in the long run. And as I mentioned, unit tests cannot be applied everywhere, and they don't replace the need for the integration acceptance testings. There are certain areas of every application that are very hard to unit test. For example, UI. Or when multiple systems have to work together in order to produce the end result. Things like this cannot be covered by unit tests. So unit tests are just one more tool in the tool belt of the software companies that help them improve the code of the product that they're developing. So, in relation, this was just generic for unit tests that can be applied to any development platform. Specifically for Servoy, unit tests have been available since Servoy 5. As most things in Servoy, unit tests are very easy and simple to do. All you need is just a method that starts with the word test. So just test, do something. And this is all you have to do in order to create a unit test that can be then run, and you get all the benefits without having to extend subclasses or add additional references to outside libraries and so forth. Probably you have noticed in Servoy 5 that there is a node, a special node dedicated to unit testing. It's the JS unit node, and it provides all the assertion methods that you need in order to do the unit tests. And currently there is only an option to manually run the unit test from the Solution Explorer. In the future there will be ways to automate this one. So again, just a single method, a method that starts with test, using the assertion methods from the JS unit node, and running the unit test is all you need to get started with unit tests. Let's take a look at a very basic example on what a unit test can do. Imagine you have some business logic function that calculates a tax given the necessary input. A unit test that verifies that results returned from that function are correct. It could be something like this. Again, the unit test method starts with the word test, and usually it's a good practice to have some naming convention that describes what this unit test is meant to test. You're not limited to a single unit test method per function. You can have as many as you want in case you need to cover different scenarios. And as you can see here, we get provided the input, we get the result returned from the actual business logic function, and we're asserting to make sure that the expected result is the same as the actual, using the assert equals method from the JS unit. Let's do a little bit live demo to make it basically to get the real feeling on how this works in Servoy. Okay. This one away. So here's our function that we want to make sure that we have written correctly. Basically, how you organize the unit tests, it's a good practice to keep the unit tests separate and outside of the actual solution that they're covering. So what we usually do is create a separate solution for unit tests that just references a module, the actual production code that you need to test. So in this case, I have a unit test solution that references the demo solution. And here in a form, I use forms, and starting with Servoy 5, you can have basically UI-less forms. So looking at this unit test form, it doesn't have anything. Looking at the parts, there's absolutely no parts. So pretty much I'm using the form as a container for code, because for unit tests we really don't care about any interface. So this is a really nice way of organizing the code. So instead of having all your tests in a single globals file, you can organize them by the different functionality that you need to cover. And I didn't open the unit test at them. Okay. And here I have a unit test that basically, given an amount of $200, for example, and a tax rate of 10, should return to me the expected $20 of tax. So how do we run this unit test? From the Solution Explorer, what we do is right-clicking on the solution and selecting the option Run Unit Tests. Well, of course, there is a shortcut Alt-Shift-Q that you can use. For now, I'll just use the pop-up menu so it's visible what the actions that I'm taking. Running unit tests launches the basically the unit test runner right in the Servoy development environment, and it produces the results from the unit test. If you have multiple unit tests running in the same in the solution, you'll see all of them and the results with the, of course, the necessary information regarding the results of the individual unit tests. And the goal of every developer is to see this bar green. The moment you see that it's not green, there is a problem that has to be addressed. Of course, being an integrated development environment, by simply clicking on the arrow line brings you to the part of the code where the assertion fails. Basically, one assumption that we have taken is not correct. And in this particular case, it's okay, well, if the tax rate is negative, really we don't expect, we expect the tax to be zero, not a negative tax. We're not turning, basically giving money back. So going back to the actual method, produces something. So we have a case where our assumption is not right, and because I don't want you to see me typing very slowly, I have here code already prepared. So we have missed one condition, checking for the negative value on tax rate, saving the whole thing and repeating the procedure, produces the results that we expected. So you can quickly interactively use this one to run individual functions from your solution to quickly see what it is. It is very easy also to debug things. So you can put the debug code right in the unit test or in the method that it refers to. So in some cases, it's much easier to run unit tests to debug through code instead of having to load the whole solution and start clicking on different buttons to get to the point where actually you're interested in. We have a question? Yes? Okay, the question is it possible to run a single unit test versus having to run all unit tests contained in the solution? And the current answer is, unfortunately, no. Currently, you run all tests including solution. This is a request that Servoy is aware of, and they are working with basically assumption that this feature will become available sometime in the future. So currently, all unit tests are running. And this brings up a good point. Ideally, unit tests should be their task should be to cover specifically only the area that the specific method covers. Do not try to do too many things. Just focus on individual piece of thing. Make the unit tests run as fast as possible, because in cases when you use the unit test in a whole integrated environment with continuous building, you want those unit tests to run as fast as possible. So just a quick demo on how you can debug through unit tests and the associated code. By running the unit test, immediately bring up the debugger, and okay, let's expand this a little bit. It's a familiar debugger when you can start stepping through the code and all that. So you can inspect everything, and in Servoy 6, you can take advantage of the new console. Any questions on the basics? The statement of throwing an exception. Basically, this is just a feature of the JavaScript language where you can throw exceptions when certain expected input is not provided by the application for one purpose or another. Okay, basically it throws just like a regular exception. So if, for example, you're trying to, let's say, connect to a database and the network is down, you'll get an exception. If you're trying to save a file and you don't have permissions, it depends on basically depends on the code that calls this method. So if it has a try catch, then it'll go to the catch block and you can either handle the exception or do some logging. If the exception is not dealt with in code, then you get to the on error of the solution, and if it's not there, it'll just use the default Servoy error handling in the smart client. Will just show you an error dialog. On the web, you just get an error calling server, and that's about it. Good point. Okay, so just for the record, the question was where this exception will be seen if thrown. Going back to the presentation. Some best practices on using the unit tests and applying them in your development process. I already mentioned, try to keep the unit tests in a separate solution. They really should not be part of your production code. They should not be deployed to the end users or to the production servers. They belong, they're tool primarily for the developers, they're tool for help you develop the product and make sure that it's stable with the expected quality. Also, there should be no dependencies between the different unit tests. In other words, when the unit tests run, they expected each one of them to be basically a separate thing on its own. Actually, Servoy utilizes multiple threads to run the different units, so you're not guaranteed the order in which the individual unit tests are run. So this again, think of each individual unit test method as a isolated piece of code that will run on its own. That means that all necessary environment settings you have to prepare for this code to execute. This comes to the next point, where any external services or state that a particular method refers to ideally should be mocked up. In other words, if you are if you use if a specific method calls a different method to get some input, and so method A calls method B, but you're writing a unit test for method A. Ideally, there should be some sort of a mock-up, because you don't want to introduce the complexity of the integration between the two different, between the two different methods. Maybe method B is in a completely different solution, and your task is not testing that solution, but testing method A. So you can have a mock-up that just returns some expected result from method B, and thus you concentrate and focus only on the code which is in method A. So kind of isolate and try to reduce the complexity to make things manageable. And later on I have an example of this, so it will become a little bit more clear on the mock-up concept. Also, in bigger companies where there are more developers, unit tests have to be written with the presumption that multiple developers may run them concurrently. And usually this is what happens. Developers, as they constantly run unit tests to make sure that they're on the right track. So any shared resources that may be accessed by the unit test, it's like regular programming. This has to be kept in mind. So if things, let's say records are being pulled from the database, or writing files to the file system or anything like this, make sure that things are isolated and there's a way of multiple people running the unit tests concurrently, and you don't end up with a case where because this developer ran this unit test a little bit ahead of time and put something in database, developer B running his unit test gets a failure just because the state of the database is no longer the same that he expected. And I'll show later on possible ways of doing that. Yes? Okay, so the question is, if the unit tests are in a separate solution, what should be the main solution that actually is active in Servoy developer? Can the unit test, the solution that contains unit test, be actually referenced as a module into the main one? This kind of defeats the purpose because you'll make the unit test code part of your production code, and you don't want that. Also, in order to run the unit test, it has to the solution that you have, basically you start the unit test runner from the active solution. It does go recursively into all contained modules and will run all unit tests contained there. And later on I use this to kind of wrap unit tests from different parts of the system together to run them as one whole thing, and you have full visibility. But ideally you want the unit test solution to refer to the business logic, so to the production code rather than in reverse. Another thing to consider is that the unit tests should be treated as a regular code in terms of maintenance, so they should be part of your source code management systems. They should be maintained, basically you can treat it as another developer task. That's why in the beginning I said that it is something that has to be accounted for, but you do want these unit tests to be considered as a long-term asset, because they are extremely useful when, let's say, the product enters the maintenance phase. Imagine in 3 or 4 years' time, after a product has been released, you have to go and fix bugs. Having these unit tests allows you to make a little change, then run the unit test for the whole application, make sure that nothing else got broken, so you don't introduce any regression issues. I showed you already that a way of using separate Servoy forms to organize the related unit tests into logical pieces, so you don't have one huge tree of things that is hard to navigate or work with. Having different forms allows multiple developers to work together without having to step on each other's toes, so to speak. So one developer may work with unit tests for a single form, while another one working on second form. Changes can be pushed up to the repository, and there will be no conflicts to resolve. Also, probably notice that almost all assertion methods have an optional message argument. It's very helpful if you do provide information in this, if you do pass this argument, because if you eventually will end up with a library of quite a few unit tests, and if something breaks, having these messages helps a lot on pinpointing where the issue is and fixing the bugs quickly. I already mentioned the fact that unit tests should prepare all their environment. They shouldn't expect that things are already in place. So before running the actual test, there should be code that either creates the necessary data in the database or prepares the necessary input required by the method that is being tested. Ideally, after the unit test runs, all that preparation should be cleaned up, so there's no artifacts or no changes introduced by just running the unit tests. For that, there are two methods that can be used to prepare and clean up the environment for the unit tests. And all you need to do is just create methods with this name setup and tear down, of course they're case sensitive. These methods are per JavaScript file. So if you organize your unit test in forms or maybe in the globals, each form, or basically each JS file will need its own setup and teardown methods to prepare those. And these methods will be called before and after each unit test method is executed. Of course, you can always use try finally blocks within the individual unit test methods to clean up data, or use the on solution open and close for the unit test solution to do some global cleaning up as needed. And let me show you a little demo on how the setup and teardown methods are can be used. Quickly go back and okay. This particular demo, I just wanted to show you the actual order in which events are being fired. So you kind of can get the picture on when these methods are being called, so you know, you have an idea what can be used in individual in each one of them. So here I have the on solution close and on and open events, and all it does is just prints out to the console that we have hit this part of the execution. Then here I have a setup and a teardown methods, and a couple test methods that's just to make my point on how things are being executed for each one of those, and basically a second one that's almost with identical structure. Running the unit tests will produce this. So, and I believe this is okay. So first executes on solution open. Let me clean up the console and run it again so we don't have anything else. Okay. We have some solution initialization code that I need for one of the following demos. So first, executes on solution open just once. Then for each test method, the unit test runner will run the setup and a teardown. So basically, both of these, then for the second unit test in this form, and it again calls the setup and the teardown. For the next form containing unit tests, again the same thing happens. The setup and teardown from that specific form are being called. So this will be the setup and teardown from here, either form B, and these are from form A. So you can see that the setup and teardown methods are for per individual JavaScript file. Going back to the presentation. Okay, something to cover is, yes, we have a question?
So there's a setup and a teardown for each individual JS file, right?
Correct.
But could you set up different scenarios? So could you have multiple setups to run the unit tests multiple times in different scenarios set up in different ways?
You can achieve that thing by having basically having different forms to contain the different scenarios, or you can have methods that prepare everything and call them as the first line within the individual methods to prepare the different scenarios. So it is possible. The setup and teardown usually are used for something, a code that is needed for all unit test methods contained in that JS file. So it's something common. If you have specific scenarios, specific scenario conditions, either put them in a separate file or have methods that you call explicitly within the unit test method. So for the try and catch, so how do we test when a code is expected to throw exceptions? In other words, if invalid arguments are being passed to a method, one possible way of indicating this is by throwing an exception. How do we test that the code did throw the expected exception? The problem arises that from the fact that the unit test runner actually uses a special type of an error object that gets thrown. So we can use this to our advantage. And in this particular case, the idea is this, that we want to make sure that whenever this method, whenever this method gets called with invalid argument, we get the required exception, and the unit test actually should fail if we didn't get the error. That's why we put this all in a try-catch block, and we use the instance of checking to make sure that the error which we got is the expected error, not the assertion failure error, which this call here will throw if we didn't get the correct one. To make this clear, it's easier if we get a live demo. In this particular case, the calculate tax should fail if the tax rate is not specified, right? So if we run the unit test, okay, this one, this is just an example of the unit test being run in a random order, basically, so don't expect on this one. Here we have something, and if we come to the code, this example of where the calculate, but we expected an error to occur, but it didn't, and the unit test immediately tells us, okay, under some condition, you didn't get the expected error. Going back to the code, we basically have to check if the tax rate is actually a number and not a string, like in our case. And this is just an example. For example, I'm checking now for this condition as well. Rerunning the unit test will produce now the correct results. Okay, now all our tests pass. Okay, and this is now basically the idea is that if for some reason this method is called with a second argument of string, not a number, you get the expected error. Yes, questions? Okay, so the question is, can the unit test point to a different database dedicated specifically for unit tests, so the production database doesn't get filled with test data? The answer is yes. One way that we are dealing with this is on solution open of the unit test solution. We're using the switch database context. So each individual developer can have their own unit test database that they're working with, so they don't need nobody else interferes with the code. And in one of the demo solutions, I do have something similar to that. Hopefully, we have time to get to it. You had a question? Correct. So basically, the idea here is that for the try-catch block, we can proactively check to see whether we got the expected exception versus trying to check whether it was an unexpected exception. Yes, definitely, this is possible with for certain types of errors already available, like the save error and the Servoy exceptions. That's possible. For the other ones, it's a little bit tricky. If people just use the throw exception with a string, because everything coming in will be a string and not a specific type. But it is possible. Next on the presentation is, I'll touch this on briefly because we're running out of time, user context and security. With the introduction of the enhanced security, now in Servoy there are two additional types of solutions, the login and the authenticator solution. Unit tests, when run, they actually run within the Servoy developer application server space. So really they don't require login. So the behavior is a little bit different when you run unit tests. In order to simulate an environment, a runtime environment where you need to have a user context, one possible solution is to use the on-open method of the unit test solution to configure the required security context. And let's try quickly on the security. The idea here is when we open, on solution open, and here I have just some utility functions to help me deal with the unit test. Basically here I'm creating on the fly a user and a group just dedicated for this specific unit test run. Here you can see where I create the user and the group and log in that user. So now later on when the unit tests run, they will have a dedicated security context, and the production code will execute with all the necessary environment needed. In addition to that, what we do is we use the current user for every record, for example, stored in the database. We have, let's say, creation user ID. And we use this to quickly clean up any records created by a specific unit test by just saying, okay, loop through all tables and all records and delete anything that is created by this unit test user. One possible side effect from using this approach. I will not run this solution because we are short on time. But definitely if you have any questions on this one, get me after the session. Some useful tips on unit testing. Sometimes people would want to conditionally configure the unit tests depend on individual developer stations to prevent these side effects from running unit tests. For example, things like you want to test a piece of code that actually writes files. On the production server, usually there will be a configuration on the server specifying in, let's say, exporting files where this thing should be exported. To mock up this in a unit test, one approach is to use the application user properties that are stored on the server develop application server. Pick up that configuration setting before running the unit tests and configure the environment as needed. The other one is mocking up the external parts of the system, as I mentioned before. And another useful tip is creating a wrapper solution that pretty much its own purpose is to combine together multiple unit test solutions. This way you have one entry point where you can run all unit tests covering your production code. Hopefully I have time to show some of those things. Here's the conditional scenario. Quickly, actually, okay. So The idea here is that we have a method that generates an export file and has to save it to a directory. Each developer may want to put this file somewhere on their workstations, and you never know what that place will be. The idea is each developer to be able to specify this directory. So what I have done is, in the Servoy properties file, there is a property that I have added, and it is this one here. Basically specifying that on this specific developer workstation, those files should be stuffed into the ctemp. As you can notice, they are entered as user properties. Okay, so in code we'll be referring only to this string, but in the actual properties file it has to be prepended with a user dot prefix. So here's how the code looks that uses this. I'm using basically a variable, so it's, if I change this later, I can change. I need to change on one place. So basically, it uses application get user property, and you get that value. Basically, will be the path to the solution. And of course, if this is not configured, I fail the unit tests giving the appropriate message. I go configure this and use this setting in the user properties file. And this is the actual test that uses it. The idea here is just to go and get, again, this is one specific case where I'm getting the necessary, preparing the scenario needed for this specific test right within the test method instead of using a setup and tear down. So before running the actual unit, the actual assertions, I get that export directory using the method I just showed before. Then making sure that the directory exists. If it doesn't, here's where I prepare a test file name, and this is the actual file. This is the actual method that I want to test in this unit test. If you go there, just a simple demo thing that just writes a string into a text file, and here I want to make sure that the method returned the expected result true, and that the file actually exists in a file server. In the finally section, I want to make sure that I delete this file. So right now what I'm going to do is put a breakpoint here, run the unit test. Now we hit the breakpoint, step over, now we got the expected result to true. So if I go to the temp directory, here's the text, this test file that got created as expected with our sample data. Coming back to here, step through it, we hit the finally, and that file is gone. Okay, so we're cleaning up after ourselves. Quickly on the other, a little bit more interesting thing is mocking up external services. And what I mean by that, one good example is you have a method that needs to get some input from end users. So it needs to show a dialog, whether it's a yes, no, or you get an input. Running this in a unit test, so let's go over this one. For example, show an input dialog. Or let's go with the warning one. Okay. The method here is, now this is my mockup solution. A second. So I have a conditional sum method that, so this is my business logic, this one example that I came up with. It is this, that if both arguments are less than 0, give a warning to the user before actually saving. Say, okay, these are below some threshold values. Do you really want me to proceed on and do whatever it's needed, right? So by running this unit test as is, currently you see I'm using plugins show warning dialog. Very simple. I go there and run my unit test, and as it runs, I get a dialog. So I have to interact with the system in order to go on. So as you can see, the unit tests are at this point, they're still going on. It's not completed yet. It's in the progress. So I have to interact with this thing to say yes or no, depending on condition here. And also, I don't know, do I need to call yes? Do I need to respond yes or no in these specific conditions, right? So it is, you cannot predict what the user, what the option the user will choose. So ideally, I would like to mock up this one, extend it out as a service, and use a service that provides to me all these input. So if when run in unit tests environment, I can mock up the actual showing of the dialog with something else where I can provide, okay, by the way, here I will mock up as if the user clicked yes or no or any other input. So how do I do this? To begin with, I comment out this line of code and use something like this. So I wrap the showing of a dialog in my own method. Inside this method, what I do is I'm using the approach of having a service that is configured at runtime. Okay, so basically, somewhere something will give me the form, the name of the form that will have this method, right? So if you go into this method here, as you can see, is this is the dialog service. Okay, so the dialog service says, okay, this is your service form that actually implements the business logic to show a dialog. Go in there, you'll see that the dialog service. Here's the smart client implementation of the show input dialog, and it does use the plugins dialog. However, I don't want to use this in my unit test. So what I need to do in my unit tests, I have a mockup dialog service. And we are just 1 minute. So here is show warning, but instead of actually showing a warning, I have basically some state information that I can prepare ahead of time to say, okay, whenever this show warning dialog is called, return this back to the caller. So I'm kind of mocking up the user interaction. So now with this approach, let's try this again. And I didn't change all instances where this is used. Give me a second here. If I follow all my to-dos. Okay. This is in each individual unit test. What I'm doing, I am preparing the service, basically saying, okay, this time this is what I want to be returned back to me. And here in the setup and teardown, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up, instead of using the regular dialog service, I'll use my mockup dialog service. So basically, I conditionally changed, basically I interchanged one part of my system that is responsible just to showing dialogues from this implementation to another implementation. Again, you can extrapolate this and say, okay, well, the same thing could be used by the same, we're running out of time, but the same principle can be used to, let's say, use the same code and stuff it into a batch processor that doesn't have any user interaction, just create another service for this type of scenario and get the input somewhere from a file or some configuration settings. So the same production code can be run in different cases, in different conditions. And we are running out of time, so just briefly showing the wrapper. The wrapper is nothing, just a solution that combines all my unit test solutions. So now by just running it, well, I do hit all my breakpoints for sure. And one more. Let's go back to the designer. here's how you can see immediately all the unit tests, things that have failed, why they have failed, quickly navigate and fix things. So this is eventually there'll be an option where something like this can be automatically exported and unit tests can be run dynamically. Do we have 1 more minute? No more? Okay. Okay. Yeah, actually lunch is ready.
Lunch in the restaurant, and next session starts at 1:40.
Okay. So, sorry we didn't have time to finish the whole thing. But if you have any questions, definitely feel free to get me. And a presentation and the demo solutions will be available at the end of the conference for you to have.